Okay, welcome back, seekers for truth. You are in the right place. It's my pleasure to briefly introduce to you my dear old friend Jan-Werner Müller, one of the great political theorists of our time. What is a political theorist? There are a number of different characters in political theory. Some in the post-Rawlsian landscape mainly do political philosophy in the mode of following through a particular deontological or consequentialist program and then design a beautiful, ideal state of the well-ordered society, just society, good society, or what have you. Others think this is a very silly enterprise and look at political theory as mainly a historical exercise. You do understand the great texts in their contexts and you teach them as a sequence that doesn't lead anywhere, but just a sequence of great ideas. Jan-Werner Müller combines the virtues of all of these approaches, but he's not a member of these families. He is more a political theorist who uses the best analytic tools that our profession has to offer, has a deep historical knowledge, but what he's really interested in is to understand the dynamics, the complexities, and the paradoxes of the present we live in. So he does this from a liberal perspective, which combines the best, I think, in the liberal tradition. So if you would compare him to figures I think he thinks highly of, I'm not sure how he thinks about Ralph Dahrendorf, but I think there is an appreciation there. So he combines people like Isaiah Berlin and Ralph Dahrendorf, the deep knowledge of the tradition of political thought that Isaiah Berlin had, with the sense of the dangers that liberty and liberal democracies face that Dahrendorf had. So how does one become Jan-Werner Müller? You got to be a wanderer between the worlds. You study in Berlin, you study in London, you get your DPhil from Oxford, you teach in Oxford, but you end up, so far at least, in Princeton, teaching political theory there. Jan-Werner Müller is also very active on the continent. He keeps being a wanderer between the worlds. He's held fellowships basically everywhere in Europe as well as the United States, including other parts of the world like Beijing. He has been a co-founder of the European College of Liberal Arts in Berlin. He's not just an author of a great many important books in political theory, but as you probably all know, he's a very active contributor of political commentaries and diagnoses to a number of daily newspapers and weeklies and journal. Among his works, let me mention a few which are characteristic for the work he's doing. In 2000, there's Another Country, German Intellectuals, Unification and National Identity. Germany is a topic for his analyses. That is a recurring one. That is also true of the next book that also appeared in German called A Dangerous Mind, Carl Schmitt in Post-War European Thought. Carl Schmitt has been mentioned quite a few times, more than usual in our cluster conferences, but so be it. Here he is again. Jan-Werner also wrote a book about constitutional patriotism, both as a theoretical concept and it's in its history, as well as what it means today. That also was published by Suhrkamp in German. His History of Ideas in the 20th Century is called Contesting Democracy, was also published in German. He wrote in German a book called Wo Europa endet, Ungarn, Brüssel und das Schicksal der liberalen Demokratie, which is very characteristic for the work he's doing. He's interested not just in the fate of liberal democracy in general, but especially with an eye to what's happening in Eastern Europe, especially in Hungary. His book on populism has been translated into, I don't know, 25 languages by now, among them German, and so he is regarded as one of the great authorities on the analysis of populism. That's also going to be the topic of the talk today. More books are forthcoming. Forst und Freiheit, ein anderer Liberalismus, with Surkamp, soon to be published, and Christian Democracy, a new intellectual history, soon to be published. We owe him special thanks, not just for coming over here, crossing the Atlantic to be with us tonight, but also for fighting a cold, which, as you can see, is still ongoing. This room actually is terribly cold, so it's not that we as brothers have an agreement to wear a red scarf while we sit on this podium. It's really, and I apologize, I hope it's getting better, but it has been very cold, so Jan is fighting a cold, so it's very heroic of him to come here. When he agreed to come, he had forgotten that this is Thanksgiving, so his family is going to hate him for not being there tonight, and that's an additional reason to be grateful to you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rainer, for this very kind and generous and comprehensive introduction. I just wish you hadn't mentioned the word families several times.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
As we learn every day, there aren't many norms left that you cannot violate in the United States. But being there for the Erntedankfest, no, that is a norm that remains in place. So it's a pleasure to be here, but I am reminded that according to that norm, I really should be somewhere else. Ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, virtually every election today, be it in Brazil or be it in Bavaria, tends to be followed by commentary, or maybe more precisely, lamentation, along the lines of people saying that yet again a vote had shown how deeply divided or how deeply polarized our societies have become. In the United States in particular, there's usually lamentation about the fact that the country has become incredibly tribalized or been subject to political tribalism. Although maybe that's a word to be used with caution. Some of you may have also read the interview with the internet intellectual Jaron Lanier from a couple of weeks ago, where he said, well, I used to always, refer to tribalism as characterizing our politics today. And then one day I receive a letter in the mail from a representative of an indigenous tribe who tells me that, at least in his experience, actual tribal life is a hell of a lot more civilized than what nowadays tends to unfold between the Reds and the Blues, the Republicans and the Democrats. Be that as it may, this diagnosis of division and polarization being the problem is, of course, in a certain way reflected in the language used by self-conscious, pro-democratic counter-movements that have emerged in our days. Just think of indivisible in the United States, and think of, as you all know, unteilbar in the German context. Now, a naive observer might look at all this and say, wait a minute, why is division exactly the problem? Isn't actually division indispensable for democracy? Democracy without division, democracy without pluralism, in our age, how exactly is that supposed to work? To which, in turn, some other observers of the scene might reply and say, well, look, it's not just division in general that's the problem. Our specific challenge today is that we see increasing division along the lines of, very broadly speaking, identity and culture. And that, as conventional wisdom has it, identities as opposed to interests are not really negotiable, and that, according to some observers, is so fateful about the increasing polarization of societies today. Furthermore, other critics of the contemporary political scene might add that what is so specifically unfortunate about the way things are going in our democracies is that we might be observing an increasing cleavage, an increasing conflict between, on the one hand, what are conventionally now, for better or for worse, referred to as populist, and on the other hand, again, for better or for worse, as a label, liberals. And that, in the eyes of these more precise critics of these developments, the really fateful thing is that we are seeing a dynamic where basically all the liberals can do in reaction to what is now conventionally described as the rise of populism around the globe, all they can do is moralize and say that these are basically bad people, bad and dangerous for democracy, and that, well, populists, of course, don't tend to hesitate in terms of being pretty harsh in terms with liberals, that as a result of all this, we're seeing a kind of dynamic of, if you like, mutual disparagement or mutual disrespect. And that, to put it very mildly, this is not a very healthy form of democratic politics. What I want to do tonight in my remarks is pose the question whether it's possible to have division and disagreement without the kind of disrespect that it seems to me those who are worried about contemporary developments have in their mind when they are concerned about the overall health of our democratic systems. What do I mean by disrespect? Well, very conventionally, I refer to the idea that one is denying the status of citizens as free and equal members of the polity. There's maybe more to be said about non-citizens in this context. Maybe we can come back to that later on in our discussion, if you like. But for the moment, let me get away with this rather conventional understanding of disrespect. I will try to offer you 3 chapters on this theme. Very briefly, I want to make a couple of very quick empirical observations about this one initial diagnosis, which comes down to saying that, oh, our big problem today is the rise of identity politics. In a second and longer chapter, I want to say something about the so-called rise of populism. And then in the third chapter, kind of make an appeal to those, both at the level of politics and at the level of, let's say, ordinary civic life, who are confronted with this rise of populism, an appeal to how they should ideally respond to populist actors. So first chapter, just a couple of very brief and quick reflections on why at least some of this initial diagnosis, conventional and popular as it has become, might be rather misguided. And as I said, these are just a couple of very quick and dirty empirical points. So when people advance this argument that, oh, our problem is the rise of identity politics, I think there are at least 4 things one should bear in mind that might be reasonably advanced as possible objections to this sort of diagnosis. First of all, it seems to me it's rather questionable that there ever was a golden age of purely identity-based politics. The workers' movement, just a special interest group that was always open to rational negotiation with others, obviously not a very plausible reading of European, or for that matter, global history. More interestingly, on a conceptual point, one could of course say that in any case, this neat division between interests and identities is deeply implausible. It's not true that it doesn't do any work in certain contexts, that it's never usefully deployed to get a hold on particular political constellations, but to entirely separate one from the other and then sort of play off history, play off a golden age against our present seems to me deeply misguided. What seems to me equally misguided is the attempt to then also smuggle in, very often, a very quick account about strong causalities. Causalities along the lines of saying, well, we're only in this, what's the technical term, shit, because of the rise of identity politics. So an example, it's very often asserted, still until today, that one of the major reasons Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 elections is because of her pushing identity politics too much. Now, obviously, by now it's become very easy and everybody has done it in terms of, beating her up for all the, millions of mistakes she made and so on and so forth. I don't want to add to that very comprehensive literature. But by now, we do have a couple of fairly detailed empirical examinations of the question of what exactly may have caused what in that fateful year 2016. Among other things, we have a pretty detailed account of what kind of topics or issues were really associated with the two main candidates. So, as one very comprehensive study out of Harvard University has shown, the three main topics that always came up in connection with Hillary Clinton, and this is not Breitbart, this is across all media, this is really a very comprehensive account of what happened across the public sphere, or what may be left of it in the US today, basically showed that there were only three topics that ever really came up in connection with Clinton. And you can probably guess which ones they were. The famous or infamous email server, the Clinton Foundation, and the events around Benghazi, i.e. the attack on the American facility and the death of the American ambassador in Libya. Nothing else played a role. So certainly not her economic program, whatever that may have been exactly, but for sure, it's highly implausible to say that the American working class sat around in 2016 and said, yeah, she would be our candidate under normal circumstances, but all this stuff about transgender bathrooms, no, that is just not acceptable, and that is just too much. Now, obviously, it would be foolish to dismiss questions of identity altogether. Of course, gender played a role. I'm not sure how well known this is, but in a sense, you might say it's shocking that even among the Democrats, there is no majority among males for the proposition, I wish to see a female president in my lifetime. This is among the Democrats, not among Republicans. So it would be too quick to dismiss identity questions altogether. But the usual story that, there's a direct line of causality from, in a sense, having gone overboard with protection of minorities, and then the working class turned against her, is definitely not tenable in this general form. Third, very brief and dirty empirical remark. What is, of course, also often smuggled into these discussions is the thought that, to put it crudely, but I think not inaccurately, that cultural capital is at least as important as financial capital. And that basically, whatever we might be witnessing by way of a reaction, a backlash against something that may have been happening in the last decades is best understood as a backlash against liberal cultural elites. We can discuss to what extent that is a plausible story or not. I'll come back to the point. All I want to flag now is how very often people then accept this point that yes, really, that is a proper description of the dominant elite in a particular context. And with all due respect, in many contexts, that's actually not a terribly plausible thought. Again, when I think about the country that I happen to live in, when I ask myself the question, so, who really calls the shots around here? Is it my colleagues and myself, who of course sit around all day making fun of hillbillies? Or is it, oh, I don't know, a random example, BlackRock, also now more well known in a German context because apparently it's a path to enter the middle class for people like, well, you know who. All I'm saying is that this kind of very easy jump to saying that, yes, cultural capital really determines, in a sense, who is the real elite, ought to be seen, ought to be treated with a degree of caution. Somebody who I think launched this idea very successfully in the American public sphere, as some of you may remember, is the New York Times columnist David Brooks. Some of you may remember his book Bobos in Paradise. That was the first sort of major argument to convince people that no, the real elite nowadays basically is based on the accumulation of cultural capital, and that's who to watch out for, that's who to look at when you want to understand what really determines how a country is going. And my gentle counterpush is to say that in many ways this remains deeply, deeply implausible. Finally, and this has been said many times, but for the record I think it ought to be said again, when it comes to supposed examples of the rise of identity politics in our time, it's at least questionable to what degree some of these examples are really properly thought of as instantiations of anything recognizable as identity politics, as opposed to simply saying, no, these are movements which are simply claiming basic rights. And that they do so in the name of particular identities is just, in a sense, to be expected in any normal democratic context. So, just to mention a couple of the most obvious examples, if somebody says, I don't want to get shot by police, presumably that's not really a claim of identity politics. That is claiming a very basic right. If somebody says, I don't want to be harassed, let alone raped, that presumably is not really a matter of claiming something as part of identity politics. Again, that's above all claiming a very, very basic right. More to be said here, more to be discussed later on if you wish, but that closes this very first chapter on, in a sense, not too easily going along with some of the, by now, very conventional, very prevalent diagnoses of what exactly might be going wrong in our democracies. Second chapter, how to think about what is sometimes nowadays described as this major conflict between populists on the one hand and, for better or for worse, liberals on the other. Well, some of you may have heard this before, some of you may have read this before, but just a few words on the question of what is populism to begin with. Conventional wisdom, I think, remains in many parts of the world that, well, populists are those who, as the cliched phrase then goes, criticize elites or somehow are angry with the establishment. When you really think about this, it's actually a very strange thought. Up until very recently, all our colleagues in, well, there's never a really good English term for this, so I'll use the German one, in politische Bildungsarbeit, would have told us that actually being critical with, keeping a close eye on the powerful in politics, in the economy, in culture, God forbid at universities, is actually a sign of being a good, engaged citizen. And come the early 21st century, we're told day and night that no, that's actually a sign of being a potentially dangerous populist. So clearly things cannot be as simple as this seemingly commonsensical definition makes it out to be. My suggestion has been to say that, yes, of course, it's true that when populists are in opposition, they tend to criticize governments. In that sense, they are criticizing elites. But above all, they tend to say that they, and only they, represent what they usually refer to as the real people, or also very typically the silent majority. This might not always sound so terrible or so dangerous. It's not obviously the same as racism. It's not obviously the same as, let's say, fanatical hatred of the European Union. And yet, I believe it always does have two, for democracy, detrimental consequences. First of all, it means that populists will also claim that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate. This is never just a disagreement about policies, or for that matter, even a disagreement about norms, which, after all, are completely normal and ideally even productive in a democratic context. No, populists, in a sense, always make it entirely personal, and they make it entirely moral, by which I mean that in one form or another, they always end up communicating that all the others are simply corrupt or crooked characters. Trump's campaign in 2015-2016 was, of course, in many ways extreme, but I don't think it was truly an exception. I think what he ended up saying and doing is what all populists end up saying and doing in one form or another. Secondly, and maybe less obviously, populists are also going to say that all those among the people themselves, among the citizens, if you like, who do not share their ultimately symbolic construction of the allegedly real people, and who therefore, of course, also politically do not support populists, that with all these citizens, you can put their membership in the people in question. Let me try to illustrate this maybe less obvious thought with one or two brief examples. So in 2016, Trump gave a speech which, given all the other sorts of things he used to say, and still says, was little remarked upon. But it contained a sentence that I thought in one way was deeply revealing, and I'm quoting it from memory. He said, this is May 2016, the most important thing is the unification of the people, because all the other people don't mean anything. So I hope you can see where this is going. Even though populists incessantly talk about unification and unifying the people, what this de facto always means is that the populace decides who truly belongs and who doesn't belong to the people. And whether you legally belong, whether you have the right passport, etc., is obviously not the decisive question here. It's a cultural question, it's a moral question, it has nothing to do with, in a sense, legal civic status. That's another way of saying that populists are always going to try to find a way to reduce all political conflicts to questions of belonging. So in that regard, it's maybe also telling that those people, those politicians, who didn't clap for Trump's latest State of the Union address this year were immediately called, well, guess what? Un-American. Not every politician does this sort of thing. Of course people have disagreements. Of course the opposition is wrong. I, the sitting president, am right. But that's categorically different from denying the legitimacy of the other side by basically telling us that they don't really properly belong to the polity at all. And then if pushed, there will be a probably mixed moral cultural question, a sort of account of why they do not truly belong. So the upshot of all this is that the important thing about populism, contrary to conventional wisdom, is not anti-elitism. Any of us can criticize elites, doesn't mean we're right, but this is not in and of itself dangerous for democracy, quite possibly on the contrary. The decisive issue is anti-pluralism. Now, we can say more about what pluralism really means in this context, maybe later on if you wish. I just let that stand for now. The other takeaway from this very brief account is that populists, in one form or another, are also always trying to wage a form of culture war. That, if you like, is ultimately their business model. That also means and I sort of just put this as a footnote because some of you might be interested in following up this on this later on, and also partly in light of the conceptual language that is suggested to us by the title of the conference. What this also means is that, of course, especially right-wing populists have to somehow flash out this symbolic construction of the real people. In that sense, it also shouldn't surprise us that when these actors come to power, they invest quite a lot in what you might call, or maybe in Frankfurt should call, a kind of political culture industry, which is to say that it becomes very important to, in a sense, practically, institutionally make good on this vision of the allegedly real people. So it does matter, for instance, that governments in, let's say, Hungary or Poland spend quite a lot on reshaping the built environment. Of course, they also reshape school curricula, they reshape the media, but this does become, in a sense, a comprehensive cultural project. Whether it should be called a form of restoration is, I think, an interesting question, and maybe one we can pick up later on, if you like. That's not quite so obvious to me. Of course, in certain ways, it's a deeply historical project. But it's also in many ways presented as actually something quite innovative, as a kind of formatting of society that maybe wants to incorporate the lessons of history, but that does not officially say we're going to restore some kind of status quo that was lost, take your pick, in the 1920s, in the 1870s, or whenever it may have been. So what's decisive is not necessarily making good on the promise of restoration. What is decisive is to make good on this promise of we are reshaping the system in line with what we take to be the authentic conception of the real people. And if they do that, I think they have a good chance of basically looking legitimate and successful in the eyes of their followers. Okay, let me leave that aside for now. Let me now turn to the other side. And let me, in a sense, try to suggest how one might most productively, most plausibly react to the kinds of actors I've just been trying to describe by, first of all, sort of taking a, if you like, via negativa and talk a little bit about what actually might be roads or approaches one should not adopt. Because I think by now, after plenty of experience, alas, with this phenomenon, it's become, I think, certainly much clearer what one should not do. And given that I think plenty of people are still tempted by some of these potential roads or approaches, I think it might be worth saying a few words about why one should not go down certain roads. And then, hopefully by implication, it's also going to become clearer which road one might want to travel down in the end. So first of all, I think one large temptation for really, in the widest sense, liberal actors in this context has been to go for something like a total exclusion of populists. To basically take a stance that comes down to saying, well, if they appear in a public forum, if they appear in a talk show, we won't appear. Or if they're already in parliaments, if they ask a question, we're not going to answer, or we might even collectively walk out. You recall that up until very recently, this was also still a stance defended in the German context by leading politicians. And this, of course, is the stance that has also made it easiest for some critics, non-populist critics, of this, broadly speaking, liberal stance to say, look, here you end up in a very obvious symmetry. You criticize these actors for being anti-pluralist, you criticize them for being exclusionary, and then you end up doing the same thing. That seems an obvious stance that is morally untenable. This is the kind of fateful symmetry of disrespect that I was hinting at earlier on in the talk, and that should be avoided. I agree with this kind of criticism, broadly speaking, but maybe it's worth kind of even going a few steps further and saying that both on a, if you like, strategic level, but also a normative level, or if you like, a democratic theory level, this stance is really unjustifiable. It's wrong and misguided on a strategic level, by which I simply mean posing the question, how do we get rid of these people? Okay, I mean, this is sort of what it comes down to ultimately. How do we get rid of these parties? How do we defeat them in one form or another? On the strategic level, this is so obviously misguided because the stance of total exclusion is bound to confirm the very narrative which populists offer to their adherents day and night. Look, these elites never listen. They don't even want to talk to us, which means they don't want to talk to you, so-called ordinary people. There are all these taboos which nobody dares to talk about, only we dare to talk about them, and look, you know, they're not willing to debate us on the issues, and so on and so forth. So one does them an enormous favor on this strategic instrumental level by effectively strengthening what they always say anyway. But there are also deeper problems on the normative level. One I've already presented. One gets into a kind of situation of symmetry where basically, in the worst case, one sees a sort of competition of exclusionary claims and moral condemnations. But less obviously, one also all of a sudden is in the position, especially if these parties already have representatives in parliaments, of denying representation to all those citizens who voted for these parties. One thing I think we should always be clear about, populist leaders, in a sense, tell us who they are through what they tell us. They are on the record as saying certain things. They are, in one form or another, communicating this core point of we and only we represent the people. But because of that, we're not in a position to say, oh, everybody who votes for them, or even everybody who turns up at their rallies, is therefore also a populist, or ultimately an anti-pluralist. For the most part, we simply don't know that. And it's perfectly plausible, I mean, forgive the cliched example, but it's perfectly plausible to imagine a citizen who says, look, you know, all this stuff that Marine Le Pen says about the other parties being corrupt and so on, I don't care all that much about that. But her agricultural policies are really fantastic. And this is, you know, exactly what I'm going for. And this is why I voted for what is nowadays known as the Rassemblement National. Maybe a strained example, but I hope you can see what work it does. It goes to show that if we simply categorically exclude the representatives, we are denying representation and therefore also ultimately standing to those who voted for these kinds of parties. This is also maybe one reason why the truly scandalous thing about that unfortunate speech that, well, yet again, I'm sorry, Hillary Clinton gave in 2016, the infamous deplorable speech, was, in my view at least, actually not so, well, deplorable because she used the word deplorable. I mean, lots of stuff that Trump and some of his followers say is deplorable. I think what was scandalous about it was something else. It's the fact that she said these people are irredeemable. In other words, she didn't recognize the possibility that even people at Trump rallies might possibly change their mind if one confronts them with certain arguments, engages them on different terms, etc., etc. Now, obviously, we know that plenty of people in democracies don't change their minds. But ultimately, the whole enterprise is based on the notion that, well, sometimes people do. That's why, after all, it is, as our colleague Adam Przeworski so elegantly put it, that's why it's best understood as a form of institutionalized uncertainty. We can't always predict what's going to happen in elections, what's going to happen in terms of people changing their minds. And declaring some people irredeemable, I think, sort of betrays a sort of deeply undemocratic intuition. What then empirically is the case, when you really try to convince people to change their minds is a separate question. But to declare people categorically, these are definitively now anti-pluralists, etc., I think is a profound mistake. Again, both at the instrumental level, but also in terms of democratic theory. Second, in my view, deeply misguided, but still very popular approach is a strategy that comes down to the perhaps somewhat paradoxical idea of destruction through imitation. So this is, of course, the well-known idea that, well, we just have to run after them and copy them, and that's how we're going to make them somehow disappear. Again, this is deeply misguided both at a strategic/instrumental level and at the level of democratic theory. At the instrumental strategic level, it's obviously misguided because, as many examples have shown, no matter how fast you run after, let's say, the Danish People's Party or Geert Wilders or whoever it might be, you're never going to catch these people. They're always going to find another thing that you have to do about immigration policy or refugees before, they will really say we're satisfied or we're telling our supporters that now the country is safe and saved. Moreover, as has also been pointed out plenty of times, if in doubt, citizens are likely to say, well, if now so-called established parties are telling us that actually some of these ideas are acceptable because they are proposing them now as well, maybe I should just vote for the original and not the copy, because after all, that seems more authentic and more focused on the actual problem. So far so obvious. Maybe less obvious what the problem at the level of democratic theory are. Let me highlight two. The first one is that through this kind of, to put it bluntly, through this kind of opportunism of the center, these sort of piecemeal adaptations towards, in this case, the populist right, what of course eventually happens is the shift of an entire political spectrum, in this case, to the right, which is not in and of itself necessarily illegitimate. The problem is with the fact that a lot of these shifts have happened without anything that could be recognizable as a comprehensive democratic authorization. So people wake up one day in, let's say, the Netherlands and Denmark, and they say, wait a minute, it's not necessarily the place where we wanted to end up. All the people who kept voting for so-called mainstream parties didn't necessarily want a radical shift in, let's say, policies of immigration and refugees, and yet one day they will end up in this space, and they have the legitimate complaint that actually we didn't really necessarily all want to go there, and all of a sudden it's really not obvious anymore how we could possibly shift back. That's one problem. The other, and I think in a sense philosophically more interesting and deeper problem, has something to do with what very often is assumed in these discussions by so-called mainstream actors when it comes to the very notion of democratic representation. Here's what I mean. Very often what tends to happen is that, again, so-called mainstream politicians switch from a stance where they say, oh, demagogues, populists are all demagogues, they always lie, we don't believe a word of what they say, plus they're deplorable, and so on. They switch from this stance to almost the other extreme, when all of a sudden they say things like, well, these populist parties appear to have revealed to us people's, as the cliched phrase goes, real concerns and anxieties. Die wahren Sorgen und Nöte. In other words, all of a sudden populists are given a kind of almost sociological monopoly of truly understanding what is happening at the core of society. And that then can become a legitimation for other parties to say, well, we have to reorient ourselves around what basically populists have revealed to us about what is truly happening in society. Now, what seems to me so misguided about this from the point of view of democratic theory is that this notion relies on an understanding of democratic representation as something like a kind of mechanical reproduction of pre-existing interests, identities, ideas, etc. So that basically magically the populist entrepreneur comes along and says, oh, I discovered something and I translated it into the political system. And thereby, we, the populists, have filled, here's a fantastic German word, the famous Repräsentationslücke. In contrast, though, I would submit to you that democratic representation is much better thought of as a dynamic process, where people's self-perceptions, not just of their interests, but even of their identities, is dynamically formed by the kinds of, if you like, representational offerings they receive, certainly from political parties, from politicians, but also from civil society, the media, friends, family, from all kinds of quarters. Now, it's not to say that this is infinitely malleable or you can do whatever you want, but if we don't see this creative and dynamic element of democratic representation, we are likely to fall into this trap of saying that, well, populists have revealed to us the ultimate truth about our societies, which, let's say in the case of left-wing parties in Europe, usually tends to come down to people saying behind closed doors, well, what they've shown to us really is that, alas, we wish it were otherwise, workers, who are also declared social authoritarian by many sociologists today, simply don't like foreigners. And we're just going to have to sort of orient ourselves around now this newly gained knowledge about our societies. So I think this trap ought to be avoided. Moreover, I think one should be much more careful than maybe is usually the case in terms of accepting what is sometimes presented as, well, more or less empirical representations of how certain conflicts in our societies are structured today. So think, for instance, about the fact that very conventionally now, in many countries in the West, it is said that we have a sort of increasing conflict or cleavage between, on the one hand, those who want open borders, and on the other hand, those who want, whatever, closure, communitarianism, whatever that might be. Seems like, in the eyes of many observers, fairly plausible way of rendering this conflict. And then, once one has accepted that description, of course, especially liberals tend to say, well, we, of course, want to occupy the center and be reasonable and kind of find the correct way of negotiating this conflict and so on. But with all due respect, who is really today an advocate of open borders? No one, with all due respect, as far as I can see, of any real political consequence in our world. Even, God forbid, in political philosophy. Okay, Joe Cairns. But beyond that, this is a distinct minority. So to present this as, objectively now we have a conflict between open borders, globalism, whatever that is, and communitarianism, closure, and so on. And then, especially the liberal inclination would be to say, well, we sort of somehow have to find a middle here, is to buy into a representation that clearly ought to be questioned. Or another example, think of the endlessly repeated invocation of a United States that allegedly is deeply split between a heartland, or to put it less politely, flyover country, and the bi-coastal liberal cosmopolitan elites. Everybody recognizes this image. everybody recognizes the fact that people in that heartland are somehow disrespected by these bi-coastal cosmopolitan elites. Except, is it really a fact? Is it really part of lived experience that people who happen to live in certain regions in the United States find moments of being disrespected for cultural or even political, let alone moral reasons? Or, to put it crudely but I think not inaccurately, is this a representation of a kind of cultural geography that is fed to people day and night by right-wing talk radio, by all kinds of people who've discovered that polarization, among other things, is actually big business? And if you keep repeating these lines, yes, you can have a lot of resonance, but to accept these representations at face value, I think is a fundamental mistake. And just to say the most obvious thing in response to it, the real split is, of course, not regional at all. It's not about some heartland versus bi-coastal cosmopolitan liberal elites. The real split, as in many parts of Europe, is between city and countryside. As far as I know, the 20 largest cities in the US today are de facto either blue or at the very least pink, which is to say sort of on the boundary between Republican and Democrat. So this is not about some kind of authentic cultural heartland versus something else. This might be about quite different conflicts. But to buy into a specific representation as if it were an objective reality is in this sense deeply mistaken. What that also means is, I think, that it's worth reviving a thought that I think was very beautifully articulated by, among others, John Dewey, when he said that giving meaning to facts has a kind of artistic dimension. It's not a science. It's a kind of craft. It's a particular ability. And if politicians can do this, if they can cultivate and successfully implement or kind of show this kind of art of refashioning the representations of some of our conflicts, and maybe more particularly, and this might be controversial for some of you, in particular if they manage to deculturalize some of these conflicts in such a way as to basically shift them to different terms, such that good faith disagreement is, of course, still possible, in fact inevitable, but is now carried out in different frameworks than purely cultural ones. I think that would be a tremendous achievement in this regard. Not an easy thing to do, obviously, but something that could also perhaps be expected of a truly talented politician who can see beyond immediate imperatives of winning elections and seeing the structure of a political culture as a whole and how that might be changed in such a way that one shifts in a more productive direction. One last thing to be avoided, very, very briefly, if I may. I think it's also become very typical that liberals have reacted to the so-called rise of populism by retreating to what de facto can look very much like a technocratic position. It's been very tempting, not only but particularly in the US, to say, look, he's always lying, his followers are probably all deluded, we have the truth, we have rationality. I mean, you only need to click on well-known so-called liberal newspapers, what pops up immediately on the website. If you care about the truth, subscribe now. The truth is usually always 40% cheaper on any given day. So this has been very tempting. And of course, it has a certain degree of empirical plausibility, especially in the context of today's United States. But I think it's another tremendous mistake, both on the strategic level and on the level of democratic theory. On the strategic level, I think what is likely to happen is that the more, for shorthand, technocrats end up saying what technocrats always end up saying, which is to say there is only one rational solution to particular policy challenges, no debate really needed. The most that parliaments can do is to basically, signal agreement with the one correct rational solution. The more this kind of thing happens, the more it provides an opening for populists to say, what do you mean democracy without choices? Where are the people in all this? So it's a perfect, in a sense, opening for them to push some of the things they've always been saying, which is not to say that they then become the authentic defenders of democracy. It's just that it makes things easier for them. And if they, in turn, are successful with their political offerings, then it becomes all the more likely that, again, for shorthand liberal technocrats are going to say, look, you give people a choice, what do? They elect crazy demagogues. So ideally, let's retrench even further. Let's take even more decision-making power away from people, even more gatekeepers, ideally. As you all know, this has been a very strong tendency also in the US to say, re-empower gatekeepers. This was the problem. Not enough gatekeepers in the primaries. We basically have to become, ideally, even more elitist because, after all, we have the truth, we have rationality, and so on and so forth. So this is likely to create a very vicious circle empirically. Normatively, it's so problematic because even though it can look like we now have two extremes opposing each other, technocracy and populism, of course the two ultimately share one thing. They are both forms of anti-pluralism. It's just that the technocrat says only one rational solution, no debate needed, and the populist says only one authentic will of the people, and by the way, only we know it, and if you disagree, you are a traitor to the people. And this is basically a recipe for making everything that we should think of as proper democracy, pluralism, choices, the chance at least of people occasionally convincing each other with arguments as opposed to deeming each other irredeemable, all that will disappear between these two poles. So that's why I think ultimately the path of technocracy should also be resisted. So what to do in the end? Wo bleibt das Positive? Especially if you come from the US. I mean, this is, come on, where's the uplifting part? So very briefly, and again, we can talk more about this if you like later on. 3 points. There are many things, there are many issues, there are many policy issues which can be openly and controversially, but also respectfully be discussed in a democracy. And this includes some of the so-called hot-button issues commonly associated with the rise of global populism. So there are many points one can take, for instance, on the question of immigration. You can be David Müller or you can be Joe Carrots. This is a debate one can have very openly in all kinds of ways. And the same also applies to debates between populists and their opponents. There is no alternative to talking with them, I believe, as long as one doesn't end up talking like them. So far, so banal. If these populists, however, specifically reveal themselves as populists, it's also absolutely crucial, and this is hopefully the less banal observation, it's absolutely crucial that other political actors mark that difference and explain where the difference and therefore also the danger exactly lies. So, real-world example that you're all familiar with. If somebody, for instance, claims that there is a secret plan by Angela Merkel to replace the German folk with Syrians, it's of course supremely important that other politicians and journalists and citizens do not treat this as yet another contribution to the debate about immigration and refugees, but call it out for what it is. Clearly, if they do so, the person in question is not going to recoil and say, oh, sorry, I didn't realize I had launched a conspiracy theory. But it's not always about Alexander Gauland. It's also about the people who witness and see this debate and the conclusions they draw if somebody makes it very clear that there is a difference between talking about immigration and refugees and this kind of systematic sowing of distrust in our political institutions, which again, for reasons I alluded to, are typical of populist actors. All that, I think, can be explained and made plausible without falling into this moral symmetry of simply ending up saying these are bad people, these are bad actors, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, I think it's also perfectly plausible for non-populists to get the point across that respect cannot mean that there is no disagreement. If you listen carefully to how many populists and also those who in a sense have some sympathy for them among intellectuals, broadly speaking, present what is happening, what you very often effectively hear is a stance that says, well, one isn't allowed to say X, Y, Z, fill in the blank anymore. Of course, it's a very obvious performative contradiction because very often these people are just saying it in a very prominent venue. And what they really are saying very often is one isn't allowed to say X, Y, Z anymore without contestation, without people pushing back. You might see this differently or might read this differently, but just to take one very recent example, if you look at some of the recent pronouncements by Uwe Telkamp, so the claim that there is this Gesinnungskorridor and you're totally confined, you can't say this, you can't say that. Well, if you read it carefully, the real claim seems to be, I can't say these things without people pushing back against me. But that clearly cannot be a definition of respect in the context of democracy. That, respect can only mean nobody is going to disagree with me or advance counter-arguments or even, to some degree, advance moral arguments. So I think that's another point that, in a sense, hasn't been made often enough and that can be explained, can be made plausible. Finally, it can also, I think, be made plausible that when populists try to argue that, well, if one disagrees with them, that also particularly shows disrespect for a particular way of life. This is disrespect for a culture. This is looking down on ordinary people. This is, we can continue ad infinitum in terms of what they would say. It's perfectly plausible to push back against that and say, no, we have a disagreement, a good faith disagreement, and that does not translate into anything like cultural disrespect for a particular way of life, because we are talking about particular policies and arguments, and when looked at more closely, these are not really an integral part of particular ways of life at all. Now, all this is, of course, highly abstract. All this is, of course, dealing with all too neat separations. As you all know, it's not always as simple and as straightforward as this to separate, let's say, questions of policy and, in a sense, typically populist attempts to, let's say, incite animus versus already vulnerable minorities. Of course, even a Trump would say, look, when I was talking about keeping out the Mexican rapists and drug dealers, that was a contribution to a policy debate. And I only meant these people, and I love tacos, and so on and so forth. But of course, everybody knows what is really meant. And everybody knows that the particular evil genius of this operation is, as so frequently in history, that it's precisely inciting hatred and suspicion vis-à-vis minorities, which, can look like real Americans by now, who can pass for Americans, but who are particularly dangerous because in this imaginary they might be the enemy within. So I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it's a legitimate expectation. One last thought, if I may. Some of you by now may also have said, well, look, what's really sort of liberal in a bad sense about all this, all I've presented to you so far, is, of course, that it's very top-down. So, politicians are going to fix this for us by saying the right thing in, public television talk shows. It's very rationalistic. Chantal Mouffe will say, yes, exactly. That's what I've always claimed. Faith in your rational arguments on policies, convincing people, and so on and so forth. Yes, to some degree. But this has only been one part of a larger discussion. And what I want to end with is that none of this excludes other strategies, other, if you like, more maybe rambunctious strategies, that also are aimed at, as said earlier, specifically trying to attack and expose the specifically populist elements of, let's say, populist discourses and conduct. What do I mean by that? Well, as you all know, there's a well-known repertoire of more on-the-ground strategies and tactics that can be deployed, for instance, against particular politicians. Think back to someone like Saul Alinsky, the famous inventor of community organizing, who said, look, sometimes, to really be effective against the powerful, you've got to ridicule them. Think back to some of what we've recently seen in the United States in terms of people going to the Senate, going to the House, and confronting lawmakers very directly, only then to be exposed to the charge that, this was a wild mob and we don't do democracy this way, and so on and so forth. But at least I don't see any reason why one shouldn't encourage those on the ground, so to speak, who want to act against populists with these more, if you like, guerrilla tactics, but with two conditions. First, whatever one does in terms of trying to ridicule or trying to, in a sense, bring out the specifically populist and therefore, in my view, dangerous elements of what these people say and do, has to be clearly focused on the core of, if you like, the normative issues. That's another way of saying, to give another concrete example, it's really no good to steal someone's clothes and then say, kein Badespaß für Nazis. Yes, you can say that's a way of trying to ridicule somebody, but I don't think it has anything to do with normative issues that are at stake in our debates today. So I don't see why this is a remotely legitimate thing to do. I also don't see how it's a remotely legitimate thing to do to, and this is the second condition, affect third parties which are not really part of these debates. So when, for instance, people went to the private home of Tucker Carlson, the well-known, well, you can't really say journalist, but host of Fox News, and were basically starting to threaten whoever was in the house, this simply ended up a way of basically intimidating his family. And then the justification was, well, look, the administration is doing things that constantly is intimidating children and the vulnerable, and therefore this was okay. I think there has to be a strong side constraint that you basically go after people who are in these debates and you don't sort of cause collateral damage along the lines of, oh, it's okay to affect third parties because, the other side might be doing that too. So this is just, in a sense, an invitation to think more about forms of, in some cases at least, civil or, for that matter, even uncivil disobedience, or if it's not even disobedience, forms of direct engagement that also try to do the work of specifically exposing what is bad about populism, but under conditions which remain and have to remain, I believe, heavily constrained. I'm not sure that was uplifting enough, but anyway, that's what I've got to offer. Thank you very much.